Hey, I'm going to talk about some things that people could do that they haven't done in the world of World of Warcraft data analysis. Two of these are going to be about gear. Third one will be about specs. And maybe we'll go in order of descending usefulness. First thing that I think people should do. You have a roster of 20 people in your guild. You have approximate drop rates for items from bosses, because you could look at something like, let me look at all the guilds that killed Forgotten Experiments in week 1 of Mythic or week 2 of Mythic, and look at how many characters in their guild are now wearing Ominous Chromatic Essence, and say, hey, Ominous Chromatic Essence is roughly the drop rate of Ominous Chromatic Essence is roughly the number of characters wearing that item divided by the number of kills times 4 or something. Because no one is going to drop an Ominous Chromatic Essence and not wear it. Now that we have group loot and not personal loot, it's pretty easy to look at drop rates from bosses as not being dependent on your group composition. Then what you do, you look at a drop optimizer for every single person in your raid for Heroic and Mythic. You look at the drop rates of items from each bosses, and you do some big old Monte Carlo simulation style thing where you just simulate re-clearing bosses 10,000 times, see what they drop, and sort of waterfall the loot that drops off of each iteration according to the highest priority from your drop optimizers. And then you see an expected value of re-clearing each boss in the raid and the expected value from re-clearing the raid as a whole. And I don't think anyone has done this, and I don't know why they haven't, because it seems like a very useful thing to know. How much raid DPS do we gain from re-clearing the raid? This is a number that you use to make decisions. And anytime we can do something that gives us a clear number on which we can make a meaningful decision, we should probably do that thing. Here, the decision we make is whether or not we should start re-clearing or extending, or whether or not we should start skipping to the final bosses in Heroic, or should we stop doing our normal re-clear a couple weeks into the tier. And people just do this based off of feel, and I think they probably get the decision wrong pretty often. So we should stop getting that wrong. And I don't think this is hard either. I don't think you make many assumptions here, and I think it's just a straightforwardly correct thing to do. The other thing number 2 that people should do is they should look at progression logs from guilds in the Hall of Fame on Rashok or Magmarax, and they should look at the characters in the raid that are wearing raid loot. Now, I think this is a very bad tier to do this exercise because raid loot was very bad, so you didn't have that many people wearing impactful pieces of gear from raid. Mostly they were wearing crafted pieces and pieces from Heroic or Heroic or Mythic Plus that were upgraded to 441, but the point still stands that it's a thing that you could do is you look at the raid loot worn by different characters. You look at the possible characters in the raid that could have been wearing that raid loot instead. So if you have male boots, you look at all the people who might conceivably use that pair of male boots, and you permute around the items, mostly between healers and DPS. And because you're looking at a log, you can look at all the damage events, and you can say hey, if this person in the log had a little bit less main stat, I can sort of just linearly adjust the damage they do to the boss by their stat weights and the amount of main and secondary stats that they lose. And similarly for the healer, I can linearly adjust the value of all the heals that they do. And I can adjust the stamina values as well. And I can see at what point of cumulative item level shifted from DPS to healers does the raid no longer have the aggregate damage to meet the enrage check of the boss. Let me break that down because it's a very long sentence that I think is saying a lot. We care about giving DPS loot over healers because you need damage to kill bosses, and the theory is that you can heal around damage and find ways to survive damage events in a more binary way than you can deal damage. In that, if I deal more damage, I sort of linearly reduce the amount of time I spend in combat, and I reduce the amount of opportunities it has for my player to make mistakes. And in particular, I have like the super linear effect where I probably reduce the amount of time that I spend in the most dangerous part of the boss, in like the very end when people are, less practice and more fried and are more prone to making mistakes. So more damage is really good. And more healing isn't always very good, because as long as someone is alive, additional healing doesn't help them live even harder. It just like keeps them in a state of already being alive. So you only really need as much healing as it takes to keep people alive through all the major damage events, and anything beyond that is useless. But something that you could look at is like, do we lose raid DPS, or sorry, how much raid DPS do we lose from shifting gear that we assign to DPS over healers? And do we prevent any deaths as a result? If our healers were X% stronger on Nagamrax, how many progression pulls end later? Almost is the question you want to say. Like, how many of the first deaths in a pull get prevented by us having stronger healers? I think this is kind of interesting. I think a reason why this might be interesting for sort of Hall of Fame but not Race to World First guilds is that people in good but not great guilds take avoidable damage or use their defenses worse than the best players do, and often have more than enough DPS to meet the damage checks of bosses. I think it's common to have this experience where, in a like world rank 150 guild, as soon as everybody stops playing like a goofball and stays alive for an entire pull, the boss dies. That sort of suggests that you had prioritized damage too much over execution or survivability. If you never meet the enrage check of a boss, you never actually know that you don't have enough damage to beat it. It is another way of thinking about that. That like, it's weird to spend 150 pulls meeting survivability or execution checks and never meeting the damage check, and to still worry about doing enough damage. It sort of suggests that the balance is off there, that like you should test this damage check at least once or twice before deciding to really amp up your damage or make sacrifices in other areas to do more damage. Another way to think about it is like, these throughput check bosses die when you sort of meet these like minimum barriers of cumulative raid DPS and HPS. And for every guild, the DPS check is the same because it's just the boss HP divided by the enraged timer. But for bad guilds, the HPS check numerator is higher than like Race to World First guilds because the bad players just take more damage. So you should not allocate gear to DPS with the same aggression that Race to World First guilds do it. You should allocate relatively more gear to your healers because they have to heal relatively more avoidable damage taken. I think this is kind of obviously a little bit harder to deal with. Like, sometimes people get assigned gear because it was replacing a really bad piece of gear. So maybe you only want to look at something like off pieces, where the alternative is a Mythic Plus replacement and not, trinkets, where you can't reasonably reassign a trinket to a healer if it's not a healer trinket. You don't want to give your, Iridius Fragment is a bad example because it's a dungeon trinket, but if it dropped off of raid, you wouldn't give your Iridius Fragment to the Holy Paladin over the Demo Warlock. That's just like a nonsensical trade to make. But you would give them like a ring over a Demo Warlock in some case if the stats justified it. The third and final thing that I think someone should do is they should look at the output of a sim, something like this, and they should get the raw event logs from each iteration, which is a lot of data, and they should try to find the sources of variance for each spec, or for one spec. I think people say these things like, oh, I got unlucky on this pull because I had this bad proc rate, or this didn't crit, or something like that. And maybe for some things that's like very easily explainable. Maybe I don't know how rogue damage breaks down, but maybe like your Beacon of the Beyond does 10% of your damage, and when it crits, it does twice as much, and you can say, like, hey, I just lost 2% damage because I didn't crit on this one beacon use. And I don't know, maybe that's like a very easy source of variance to explain. But for some specs, certainly I felt like playing Enhancement, the sources of variance are a little bit more hidden. Like, obviously, Hot Hands and Ascendance are really big things, but I've had some pulls where I have 20% Ascendance uptime in each of them, and I do wildly different damage, and it's not really clear to me why. So, someone should look at this and run something like a bunch of linear regressions from different sources of variation to the demeaned damage on an iteration. So I don't know, if your mean is like 130k DPS, you look in the iteration that has 140k, you look at some predictor to the responder of, 10,000, outperformance relative to the baseline damage. And you say, like, what factors are influencing this? How much is 1% Ascendance uptime worth to your DPS outperformance? Something else I think someone should look at it in this same vein is, like, if you take a fixed iteration in a sim that has some crit rate of, let's say, 30% across the abilities, if you reshuffle all of the crits in this iteration to different abilities, and you do this 100,000 times, what does the resulting distribution of damage look like for that? In other words, how much does it matter for your overall DPS which abilities crit versus having an overall higher or lower crit rate? My guess would be for something like Enhancement Shaman, this is actually not that important because you have a bunch of abilities that do relatively similar damage, and you have a ton of damage events. Like, you have, Flame Shock ticking all the time. You have, like, various small procs or, main hand and offhand attacks that are all hitting for small amounts of damage over many times. So there's no one large, source of damage that you could attribute all of your crit variance to. But maybe there's some specs that do, all their damage comes in the form of, like, large executes. And so if that crits, then they do, 5% more damage. And if they don't, they don't. And that would be an interesting thing to look at. And then you could look at some things like, you just have more clarity for why your spec feels different from pull to pull. And I don't know if this means that you do anything meaningfully different other than feel better about yourself when you do bad damage, but it's an unknown factor in the game that I don't think anyone has really explained carefully.